This is part 3 of the video review we are doing on the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross book by John M. Allegro. We're going to continue on from where we left off. In part 2, here, etymology has done more than discover the root meaning of a particular word. It has opened a window on prehistoric philosophic thought. The idea of the shepherd king's role in the community did not begin with the invention of writing. The written word merely expresses a long-held conception. If then in our search for the origins of religious cults and mythologies we can trace the idea back to the earliest known written texts, we can use etymological methods to probe even further into the minds that gave them literary form. Having arrived back at the primitive meaning of the root, the philologist has then to work his way forward again, tracing the way in which writers at different times use the root to express related concepts. For of course the meaning of words change. The more often they are used, the wider becomes their reference. Today, with faster and easier means of communication, it is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain control over the meanings of words, and this at a time when the need for understanding each other is most crucial. In antiquity, people and ideas did not move quite so fast. Travel was not easy. Remote areas would stay remote over generations, and the languages would preserve old words and linguistic forms long lost in places more open to foreign influence. Religious terminology, which is the special interest of this work, is least susceptible to change, even though day-to-day words must develop their meanings to accord with social conditions and the inventions of new crafts. Communication with the God required a precious, unchangeable liturgy whose accurate transmission was the first responsibility of the priesthood. In the study of ancient literatures, the scholar has to bear in mind that the language of the hymns and epics may well differ considerably from the common tongue of the same period. One of the problems facing the student of Old Testament Hebrew is the probability that the classical tongue of the Bible does not accurately represent the spoken language of the ancient Israelites. Certainly, the vocabulary of the Bible is far too limited in extent to tell us much about the workaday world of the ancient Canaan. When it comes to analysing the linguistic and phonetic structure of biblical Hebrew in terms of actual speech, the conviction grows that what we have is not the spoken dialect of any one community living in a single place at one time, but a kind of mixed artificial language, composed perhaps of a number of dialects in use specifically for religious purposes. The importance of a liturgical language from our immediate point of view is that it will have been essentially conservative. It is in such writing that we can expect to find words used in their most primitive sense. If religious terminology in general tends to resist change, this is even more the case with proper names, particularly those of the gods and epic heroes. It now appears that in many cases these have survived unaltered over centuries, even millennia, of oral as well as written transmission. In this one category of words lies the greatest scope for present and future researchers into the nature and meaning of the old mythologies. To be able to decipher the name of the god will tell us his prime function and thus the meaning of the prayers and rituals by which he was worshipped. The difficulty in this study has always been that the names are often very much older than the literature in which they occur and are indecipherable in that language. So often the commentator on some Greek myth, for example, has to confess that the hero's name is pre-Hellenic, of uncertain origin and meaning. All that he can do in such cases is to gather together all the references he can find to that character and see if there is some common denominator in the stories or epithets which will give a clue on the meaning of his name. Anyone who has tried this procedure on his own account or studied in detail the efforts of others will know too well that the results are often at best tenuous and the exercise, to say the least, frustrating. One problem is that the same god or hero is differently described in Athens and in Crete, for example. Different heroes differently described in different places. Zeus merits distinctive epithets and worship in Athens and in Crete, for example. What you expect of your god depends on your physical and spiritual needs in the immediate situation, and the stories you make up about him will reflect the social and ethnic conditions of your own time and place. Clearly, the mythologist can best estimate these local and temporal factors in his material if he knows the god's original place in the order of nature, that is, if he knows the source and meaning of his name. The dramatic step forward that is now possible in our researches into the origin of Near Eastern cults and mythologies arise from our ability to make these decipherments. We can now break down god names like Zeus and Yahweh or Jehovah, and hero names like Dionysus and Jesus, because it is possible to penetrate the linguistic barriers imposed by the different languages in which their respective literatures have reached us. We can reach back beyond the Greek of the classics in the New Testament and the Hebrew of the Old Testament to a linguistic source common to all. Furthermore, as might be expected in such a limited geographical area as the Near East, we find that not only have the names a common derivation, but many of the religious ideas variously expressed by the different cultures stem from the same basic ideas. The forms of worship, so as far as we can reconstruct them from our limited literary and archaeological evidence, may appear quite unrelated, and the stories that circulated about the gods and heroes may reflect different social and ethnic backgrounds, but the underlying themes are turning out often to be the same. The worshippers of Dionysus headed their cultic processions with an erect rod, while those of Jesus symbolized their faith with a fish and a cross, but essentially all represent that common theme of fertility and the creative power of the God. Even within the Bible, language has hitherto posed a major barrier to research into Christian origins. Jesus and his immediate followers are portrayed as Jews living in Palestine and adopting Jewish customs and religious conventions. The religion propounded in the New Testament is at root a form of Judaism, but the language in which it is expressed is Greek, a non-Semitic tongue. Yeah, that came later, right? But originally they were speaking Galilean Aramaic, and then somebody decided to translate all into Greek. Words and names like Christ, Holy Ghost, Jesus, Joseph and Mary come through Hebrew channels but have Greek forms or translations in the New Testament. The words of Jesus are quoted freely and often given the weight of incontrovertible authority, but in fact nobody knows for certain what he said, since what we have are translations of a supposedly Aramaic original of which all trace has otherwise been lost. Well, we have the original ancient Galilean Aramaic from the Apostolic Church of the East, who supposedly the high priest, when they given these manuscripts by Thomas, the writings of what they heard and saw Jesus do, miracles, etc. They wrote it down, and then when the Church of Jerusalem was burnt down and destroyed, they fled with them, and they gave them to these high priests in training, who later ordained, who would ordain more priests, etc., etc. The Church would go, who then hid them from Emperor Constantine, and for 2,000 years these being hidden, therefore preserved, were intact, not messed with, not tampered with, altered in any way, or translated even, as testified by the once head patriarch in 1957 of the Apostolic Church of the East, Mar Isai Shimon. It was on the Aramaic Scriptures.com, the website of the translation of the Eastern Syriac Peshitta from that same church by Messianic Jew Andrew Gabriel Roth, but he took it down for some reason. But you can find it in one of his books. We've just forgotten which book it is exactly, but we came across it intact inside there. So that was his testimony to that fact in 1957 when he was head patriarch. Kate. So a large part of Christian scholarship has been devoted to trying to reconstruct Semitic expressions underlying New Testament phraseology, with varying degrees of success but little absolute certainty. In the forms in which we know them, Greek and Hebrew are very different in vocabulary and grammatical structure. they belong to different language families. The one Indo-European, like Latin and English, the other Semitic, like Aramaic and Arabic. Translation from one into the other can be at times extremely difficult, since they express not only distinctive linguistic attitudes, but underlying philosophies. One impediment to mutual understanding between the Semitic and non-Semitic world today is that mere mechanical translation of, say, Arabic words into English cannot express adequately the intention of the speaker, and dangerous misunderstandings can too often arise as a result. Well, that's because the terminology, the Eastern terminology versus the Western terminology, the Eastern mindset versus the Western mindset. So, like in the East, you have this mindset where, okay, yeah, that could be a lie, but we still believe it. They have their idioms, the way they express themselves, they put it across, which most times, if not all times, when we read them, we think, oh, okay, that's what it means, when it really doesn't. Yeah, and having a Western mindset, yeah, they're like, looking at something, that's like, sounds like doesn't make sense, you know, defies logic and common sense or whatever, just doesn't make sense. So they tend to poo-poo it, yeah, different kind of mindset, different kind of education, etc. Yeah, so we're gonna jump quite a big jump here to see how this all relates to the Christianity, Jesus, etc. So a good place to start. Bible is a book of morals. A new understanding of the relationship of the Indo-European and Semitic languages has opened up fresh fields of exploration. We're at the beginning of what could be the most fruitful and exciting period in the study of our own culture and its origins since objective scientific research began. Now that we can decipher the old god and hero names and lay bare the fundamental and conceptions of the ancient philosophies and nature religions, we can better appreciate the import and motives of their mythologies. As far as the Bible is concerned, our new appreciation of the origins of Yahwism within the fertility philosophy, and not, as have been commonly supposed, in opposition to it, means that we must start again in assessing the part played by the prophets in the cult's development. The old chronological framework on which so much of our understanding of religious progress has in the past been based is in ruins. The road from Abraham and Ur of the Chaldees through the patriarchs and Moses to the prophets and Jesus of Nazareth has vanished. Development there certainly was, the crude fertility imagery which saw a mighty rod in the sky, spermatozoa every time it rained, etc., etc. The remote phallic deity in the heavens could now be apprehended by the believer in possession of the secrets of the drug plants and fungi, as Joe Rogan said on that video. Yeah, supposedly it's covered in a certain substance and it just grows immediately, bam, comes out of nowhere, and then these people saw it on animal feces, picked it up, chewed on it, whatever, put it in their meal and spun out, you know. For the first time we can begin to understand the precise reference to some of the prophetic utterances about contemporary Yahwism. We have noticed a few instances, particularly in the book of Isaiah, where fresh light has been thrown on the place of the cultic prostitute in the local religious practices and the nature of their gardens that she tended. In such places the prophet seems utterly opposed to the mushroom cult. On the other hand, where, for example, Ezekiel decries the cultic abominations of the Jerusalem temple, the phallic processionals, and the woman bewailing Tammuz, the very nature of the vision that transported him from Mesopotamia to Jerusalem, and the apparitions of whirling, I-studded wheels are very reminiscent of the reported psychedelic effects of the drugs of the Amanita muscaria, or the red and white mushroom. Furthermore, the worship of the sacred fungus, as we can now appreciate, was an essential part of the oldest Hebrew heritage. Many of the patriarchal legends and names are based on mushroom imagery and nomenclature. As we saw, mushroom worship, by its own extreme nature, is fanaticism and bouts of uncontrolled frenzy bred its own opposition among normal people. More balanced religionists condemned these aspects of the cult, and the Old Testament records successive attempts by kings and prophets to purge its abominations from the land, but they were too deeply rooted to be wholly successful. Even the most intensive and successful of the purges, carried through with ruthless intensity during the Nehemiah-Ezra reforms after the exile, simply drove the mushroom cult underground, whence it re-emerged in later centuries for far more dangerously in the politically oriented movements, Zionism and Christianity. We must abandon then any oversimplification of the religious picture presented by the Old Testament. It is not the story of one people's revolt against the heinous fertility worship of the land to which their desert god had led them. Despite the dramatic episode of Elijah on Mount Carmel, the theme is not Yahweh versus Baal. Yahweh was Baal, as he was Zeus and Jupiter. The names, as we have seen, sound a common note of sexual import. In any case, the old idea that the religion of Yahwism centered upon a glorification of the desert purity as against the orgiastic fertility practices of the sown land had never quite as much textual support as some of its propounders liked to think. If we need radically to reason the Old Testament traditions in the light of the new discoveries, the New Testament situation is far more bleak as far as the Christian is concerned. We must be in no doubt of the effect that importing a new mushroom element into the New Testament picture must have on our understanding of one of the strange non-Greek phrases, have on our understanding of the origin and nature of Christianity. It needed only the decipherment of one of the strange non-Greek phrases in such terms to upset the whole previous picture of the beginning and the growth of the church. If, for instance, Boanerges is correctly to be explained as a name of the sacred fungus, and the impossible translation appended in the text, Sons of Thunder, is equally relevant to the mushroom, then the fidelity of the whole New Testament story is immediately undermined. For the pseudo translation demonstrates an intention of deceit, and since mushrooms appear nowhere in the surface tale of Jesus, it follows that the secret reference to the cult must be the true relevance of the whole. If the writers have gone to the trouble of concealing by ingenious literary devices, here and as we have seen in many cases elsewhere, secret names of the mushroom, not only must its worship have been central to the religion, but the exigencies of the time must have demanded they should be transmitted among the initiates and their successors in a way that would not bring the enemies down upon them. It therefore follows that the surface details of the story, names, places, and possibly doctrinal teachings must be equally as false as the pseudo renderings of the secret names. One immediate result of the cracking of the already very fragile skin of the New Testament story is that all these doubts about its details, which have so exercised scholars over the years, are brought sharply back into focus. There always has been extreme difficulties in understanding the story of Jesus. There are in the New Testament picture many kinds of problems posed on historical, geographical, topographical, social and religious grounds, which have never been resolved. But to the Christian scholar they have always seemed of less relevance than the apparently incontrovertible fact of the existence of one semi-divine man who set the whole Christian movement in motion, and without whose existence the inauguration of the church would seem inexplicable. But if it now transpires that Christianity was only a latter-day manifestation of a religious movement that had been in existence for thousands of years, and in that particular mystery cult formed for centuries before the turn of the era, then the necessity for a founder figure fades away, and the problems that have for so long beset the exegete become far more urgent. The improbable nature of the tale, quite apart from the miracle stories, the extraordinarily liberal attitude of the central figure towards the Jewish quislings of the time, his friendly disposition toward the most hated enemies of his people, his equivocation about paying taxes to the Roman government, the howling of Jewish citizens for the blood of one of their own people at the hands of the occupying power, features of the gospel story which have never rung true, now can be understood for what they have always been, parts of a deliberate attempt to mislead the authorities into whose hands it was known the New Testament documents would fall. The New Testament was a hoax, but nevertheless, this is according to this writer, right? John M. Allegro, not us, Allegro, sorry. But nevertheless, a deadly, serious and extremely dangerous attempt to transmit to the scattered faithful secrets which the Christians dare not permit to fall into unauthorized hands, but to whose preservation they were irrevocably committed by sacred oaths. Let it be repeated, if even one only of the mushroom references of the cryptic phrases of the New Testament text were correct, then a new element has to be reckoned within the nature and origin of the Christian religion. The new element, furthermore, is the key that fits the phenomenon of Christianity firmly into the surrounding mystery cult pattern of the Near East, but it does so at the cost of the validity of the surface story, which knows nothing ostensibly of mushroom cults, and which offers for its sacred cultic titles and invocations deliberately false translations. This is not then the record of an evangelistic crusade, an open-armed invitation to all men to join a new society of the redeemed, whose sacred meal is no more than a service of remembrance. It is not the manifesto of an organisation whose revolutionary tendencies go no further than the exercise of a group communism of property, but whose teaching urges women to submit at all times to their husbands and slaves to their masters, being obedient with fear and trembling. It was not for this pacifism that the Romans dragged forth the celebrants of the Christian mysteries and butchered them. But if the stories of Jesus are no more historically real than those of Adam and Eve, Jacob and Esau, and even of Moses, what of the moral teachings of the Bible? Whilst it is true that, freed of the pious inhibitions we so often brought to the scriptures, we can now more readily appreciate the literary qualities and humour of the legends. We have also to acknowledge that the Jews and Christians have not gone into the Bibles for entertainment, or not to be enlivened by its merry tales. Generations of believers have sought in these Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek works the very word of God. They have believed that here were enshrined laws for mankind, through which alone moral stability could be achieved, in defiance of which would mean ruin and punishment, if not in this life, in the next. The very dubiety of much of the text has seemed to many added reason for believing in its divine inspiration. The question has now to be asked, supposing for the moment that there ever was any foundation for the belief that the Bible was a guidebook to moral living, how far can our new appreciations of the origins and nature of Judaism and Christianity continue to give its teachings universal authority? This perhaps is the most crucial issue raised by the present discoveries. It is not just that Jesus, and probably Moses, disappeared from history. This loss might still be borne with equanimity, at least by those uncommitted to the religions they represent, if the teachings attributed to them could still be held as valid. There are many people who are not Jews, and whose Christianity stops short of participation in the ritual, but who fervently maintain the authority of the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. They would argue, without necessarily having studied either passage very closely, that they embody a store of practical experience and moral idealism that will serve mankind for a long time. Yet, no matter what happens to the religions of Moses and Jesus, this is not the place to answer these questions, but it would seem a useful exercise to end our study by setting out afresh for consideration some examples of this moral teaching of the Old and New Testaments, examining their immediate literary sources and keeping these larger issues in mind. We might begin with the Ten Commandments, or 10 words as they are called. We earlier saw how the myth of the revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai was formulated. The idea of 2 tablets, derived from the 2 halves of the mushroom vulva, the round loaf-shaped form being that of the very early clay tablets. From the Sumerian name Tabara, literally, came indeed our word tablet, via the Greek and Latin tabula. The number of the commandments or words came from a play upon the same Sumerian name in the fuller form, Mash Tabari, read as 5 words. That is 5 on each tablet. Here they are. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself a graven image, or any likeness that is in heaven above, or in earth beneath, or in the water that is under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God. Rashi reads, he's a zealous God, punishing the wrongdoing of fathers upon sons to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing kindness to intimates, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not swear by Yahweh your God insincerely, for Yahweh will not clear him who swears by his name insincerely. Take due note of the Sabbath, so set it apart. 6 days you shall work and carry out all your tasks, but the 7th day is the Sabbath to Yahweh your God. You shall carry out none of your tasks, you or your son or your daughter or your manservant or your maidservant or your beast or the stranger who lodges in your house. For in 6 days Yahweh your God made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them, and has rested on the 7th day. So he blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart. Honour your father, etc., etc. As a code of laws, these 10 words leave much to be desired. The first 4, perhaps 5, seem to be purely religious and cultic from the point of view of social relationships. Only the last 5 seem relevant, and the last is a matter of attitude rather than directly anti-social action. More serious, the stark commands of the code receive no codification. In the desert community in which they are generally supposed to have had their primary relevance, do not murder and do not steal would be incomprehensible, since the Bedouin raid was a way of life and a necessary means of livelihood. Even taken out of this dubiously historical setting, whilst as a general rule of conduct these 5 commandments are obviously good sense, they offer no guide about infringements of the laws, treatment of culprits, and the all-important matter of making good damage done to other people. Of course, in such aphorisms, we should not expect to find the legal niceties stated in all detail. It is a statement of principles rather than legislation, but 5 or 6 principles are little enough on which to base a practical guide for the complexities of day-to-day living of whatever age. As a matter of comparison, we might cite a few examples of a real law code from Mesopotamia around 1700 BC. If a citizen has accused another and charged him with murder, but does not substantiate the charge, the accuser shall be executed. If a citizen has stolen an ox, or a sheep, or an ass, or a donkey, or a mule, or a pig, or a boat that is the property of the temple or of the crown, he shall make a 30-fold restitution. But if it is the property of a vassal, he shall make a 10-fold restitution. If the thief is destitute, he shall die. He's homeless, he's got nothing, he's going to die, and so forth. Just right down to the end of the page. If he destroys the eye or breaks the bone of a vassal, he shall compensate him 1 mina of silver. From the stele of Hammurabi, around 1792 to 750 BC. It is not the intention in quoting from these examples of biblical and Mesopotamian laws to make a comparison in their respective standards of morality. Canons of justice vary with the social stratification of communities. One law for the rich and another for the poor is an immense step forward from the stage where the have-nots could expect no justice at all. In the Hammurabi Code, we have a systematic attempt to put the kind of overall principles crisply stated in the half dozen or so relevant words of Moses into some practical legislation. It is all very well saying do not kill, but what happens when someone does shed another's blood and incurs blood guilt? How does the community avoid family feuds which might trail on for generations? You have certain African tribes that 3,000 years or more they always had this custom to kill the other one because they had some sort of grudge that lasted that long, right? It had been continuing that long, so it was no problem to them to chop their finger off or something like that. An example we have from one of our Jewish tutors, computer-wise, he was a South African Jew. He said basically because he was in the military and they wanted to know where these rebels were in a certain South African town, and he's asking this lady with a child or something like that, asking, and the other guy, who was African, says, "You're wasting your time, mate." And he like threatened her and apparently chopped off one of the fingers of this kid, or her finger or something. I think it was the kid, and said, "Where are they?" She said immediately, "Oh, they're over there." Yeah, and they rounded them up. Yeah, she was stalling. She's probably scared now. One of them might take a pot shot at her or whatever. But he says he basically was saying, because she's of this race. Because he said, "What did you do that for? That's mean, man." She said, "Oh, I don't care because they're Tutu or whatever, whatever they are, and I'm Hutu, whatever. So we had grudge 3,000 years or more. We don't care. That's how we are, that sort of thing." Yeah, he couldn't understand it. She said, "You'd never get an answer out of her, right? Because she's covering for them, right? Maybe in fear, but she's covering for them. She knows where they are, so you just went chop with this machete. Oh, she pointed out straight away, over there, They went and rounded them up. Okay, close examination of the 10 words of the Bible show that they are probably derived from wordplay on two prime Sumerian fungus names, Mashtabali, Rili, Limashbalag, and all this sort of stuff. Okay. The preamble, "I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you forth from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage," is fundamentally based upon the name of the fungus as the Egyptian mushroom properly, as we have seen the stretch to erect one. The self-identification, "I am Yahweh, your God," merely states the normal Hebrew, the Sumerian original of those divine names, Ilauya, juice of fecundity, or seed. Hebrew Elohim and Yahweh, Yahoo, the play on Mesh Balag Anta, and the Semitic phrase for forced Levi, Mas Palach Pulkachen, we noted in connection with Issachar. The last part of the name Tabbari gave the play on the root DBR. It's a trilateral rule, right? Don't have the vowels in between, it's DBR. Lead out. "You shall have no other gods before me" comes from the play on the repeated invocatory Ilaua, Uya, is it afraid there is no God save Elohim. What makes this phrase especially interesting is that it is almost exactly the rallying cry of the Muslim, to witness that he makes on his self-surrender and takes the faith there is no God save Allah. Also using invocation Ilah. I see what they're talking about. That Ilaha, Allah, something like that, right? Sounds very much like that. Ilaha, something. Yeah, and that's supposed to be, once you say that, you're instant Muslim.